All right. And so I think I am just going to let each of the presenters to introduce themselves. And in order, as a quick reminder, we're going to start with Salma, then Grace, and then Alex and Ashley. So please, in that order, go ahead to introduce yourself and go ahead with the presentation.
All right, can you all see my slides okay? Okay, wonderful. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today for my short presentation titled Building Community Archive Partnerships, Considerations, Pedagogies, and Cohort Building around the Islamic Center of Southern California Community Archive. My name is Salma Abumeeiz, and I'm a research and instruction librarian at the University of California, Los Angeles Library, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples, upon which I am a grateful but uninvited guest. With the time I have with you today, I hope to talk to you about the Islamic Center of Southern California Community Archive and how it embarked on a collaboration with UCLA students, staff, and faculty in support of that effort. In addition to providing an overview of that partnership, I also want to emphasize how this group tried to model ethics of care, humility, and mutual responsibility while pursuing this collaboration. So foremost, before I talk about this community archive, I want to provide some context about this community, that being the Islamic Center of Southern California, also known as the ICSC, as well as the impetus for its efforts to begin self-documenting its rich history. So the ICSC was established in the mid-1950s in Los Angeles, and at that time, it was the only known mosque in the city. What began as a small group of individuals who wanted to come together to pray grew in tandem with the growing presence of Muslim communities in Los Angeles throughout the mid to late 20th century. Eventually, the center became one of the most historically significant and eminent Islamic institutions within Southern California and beyond. Due to various circumstances, the physical location of the center moved across LA several times, including a building on St. Andrew's Place, as shown in the photograph on this slide, eventually arriving at its current location on Vermont Avenue in central LA, which is today on the corner of Koreatown and Little Bangladesh, where it has been since 1976. The center's community is multilingual, multiracial, and multi-ethnic, whose members span multiple generations, diasporas, and experiences, and it prides itself in these multitudes. In recognition of its rich and complex history, two longtime ICSC community members named Sadiq Alu and Hashim Sharif, and I think Hashim's here, so hi Hashim, reflected on their own knowledge and expertise with the history and identity of the center, and as I understand it, determined that there was an immediate need to be more deliberate about recording, preserving, and making accessible the history of the center. In light of this, and in recognition that the center and its community members house an abundance of physical and immaterial records, Sadiq and Hashim proposed the following 3 objectives to ICSC Board of Directors to initiate their self-documentation project. And those objectives were to 1, use this initiative to identify what makes the ICSC unique, 2, learn from past challenges and chart the future, and 3, preserve this history and these unique experiences for future generations of researchers to provide the data needed for their investigation. And from these objectives emerged the idea to establish a community archive, which is where and how I became involved in this work. In August of 2020, Sadiq, Hashim, and a volunteer named Amalia Sikek, who did significant work in the early stages of this project, reached out to myself and my fellow UCLA library colleague, 𝐏𝐚𝐬𝐿, to share their objectives and intended outcomes for this archive, and to solicit feedback and collaboration on how to move forward with it. What started out as a few preliminary conversations and exchange of ideas within our group blossomed into us having the idea to collaborate with archival studies and other UCLA students. This eventually resulted in project work in support of the ICSC archive being embedded into 2 graduate courses, one which ran twice and 1 graduate course, collaborating with over 50 students in total, 2 faculty members, and library staff spanning 4 academic quarters. And before I talk about those collaborations, I want to just pause and say that regarding my own involvement with this work, I'm very aware of the real and necessary skepticism that comes with an outsider such as myself collaborating on something as valuable as community histories and experiences. I'm also attentive to the real anxieties and concerns of having community information be made available publicly in an archival setting, and how that is particularly true for communities, including Muslims, that experience oppression as a result of regimes of power and domination, including surveillance. And I don't take this responsibility lightly, especially as someone who's only lived in LA for a few years, and as someone who was previously unaffiliated with the center prior to this project. I'm very grateful and humbled to be extended this trust. And while my own research and educational background and training is in history, libraries, self-documentation, and Muslim diaspora communities in the West, I want to acknowledge that archivist is not formally reflected in my job title or description. So I'm especially excited to be in this space with you all to share what I've learned and to hear from you all during the Q&A about your perspectives on these topics. So I'm just really excited to be here. So I want to list the faculty and student collaborators to acknowledge their incredible work with gratitude and to illustrate the scope of the cohort we've been able to build around this work. These course partnerships started in the spring of 2021 when I reached out to Dr. 𝐏𝐚𝐻𝐫𝐬 about the possibility of collaborating with the Department of Information Studies at UCLA. This led to ICSC archival projects being embedded in her spring of 2021 community archives class. Michelle then graciously introduced me to Dr. 𝐏𝐚𝐻𝐫𝐬, who similarly worked with us to identify projects for her archives, records, and memory course in the following fall of 2021. Then in the spring of 2022, a second cohort of Michelle's community archives course undertook ICSC archival project work, along with undergraduate students enrolled in a section of the Global Islam Cluster, which is a year-long interdisciplinary freshman class. That section was titled Grassroots Self-Documentation, Community Archives Among North American Muslims, and I taught that section. And in the case of the graduate courses, ICSC project work could be optionally selected in lieu of a final paper, and for my undergraduates, project work was a required component of the final. So these course collaborations have, after dialoguing with Sadiq and Hashim and conducting a community needs assessment of the archive, resulted in the following projects being identified and carried out within the courses I just outlined. And these have included, a vision, mission, and collection policy developed with our inaugural class, along with a digital component of the archive powered through 𝐀𝐚𝐻𝐫𝐬, which has currently become the primary space of the archive, to things like digital photographic heritage exhibits to activate many of those records, which my undergraduates worked on, along with all of the incredible and essential projects you see here on the screen. And I could talk at length about how wonderful our collaborators are and how important their contributions were to laying the bedrock of our archive, which is all absolutely true. But what I want to spend the majority of my time with you today exploring is how we grappled with the ethical considerations associated with pursuing an informal institutional partnership between UCLA staff, students, and faculty and community members from the ICSC, how we tried to model principles of accountability, care, and reciprocity in that space, and how we attempted to resist and model alternatives to traditional academic dynamics that treat community members as research subjects and not as partners and co-authors. So in our case, one principle we tried to model at every stage of the process was to center reciprocity and mutually beneficial relationship building. In other words, working with and not for the Islamic Center. I'm really inspired by Simon Fraser University's Community Engaged Research Initiative's ethical principles, which calls on researchers working with communities to, quote, approach community members as intellectual partners. So we tried to think about how we could model that, from soliciting student collaborators to carving out projects and project requirements to engaging in sustained, transparent communication. We also wanted to resist, as outlined in the crucial white paper, Come Correct or Don't Come at All, building more equitable relationships between archival studies scholars and community archives by the Reciprocity in Researching Records Collaborative, and hopefully you got a chance to attend that workshop yesterday, it was great, to resist this harmful tendency of institutions devaluing knowledge and intellectual labor produced outside of the academy and conceiving community engaged work without mutual benefit, thereby engaging in parasitic relationships with community by sort of parachuting in, extracting knowledge, and engaging in transactional consent. So rather than just having UCLA staff, students, and faculty kind of swoop in, use the community's time, resources, and labor to create projects that had little benefit for the Islamic Center, we instead tried to think about how symmetrical collaborative partnerships and mutual learning could be modeled through this work, which would create richer, more meaningful learning experiences for everyone involved, and would also promote long-term thinking and sustainability, and that community members would learn alongside students and acquire the tools to continue this work even after the students completed their courses, thereby ensuring that it could continue. And finally, when soliciting graduate student collaborators for this project, we emphasized the importance of flexibility in meeting the community where they are, while also addressing their documentation, communication, and all other project management needs from their perspectives rather than from that of the academy. One example of this was, I recall overhearing a conversation when we did an on-site visit between a board member and a student collaborator, where the board member asked the student, well, what do you need from us? What works best for you? And the student responded back, well, what works best for me is what works best for you all. And that's sort of exactly the kind of principle we try to model throughout this work. So as a means of ensuring that we were accountable to the ethics of reciprocity and mutual benefit, core principles that were embedded into not only the workflows, but also the pedagogical approaches to these projects were transparency, humility, and amplification, not empowerment. With my undergraduate students in particular, we would often take on a discussion-based approach to our classroom to grapple with various dimensions of community dynamics, community archive dynamics, and working with the ICSC in particular. For instance, we'd acknowledge dynamics surrounding insider-outsider status and ask ourselves questions such as those displayed here on the right-hand side of the screen, including what are some characteristics of a parasitic research approach versus a mutually beneficial one? What are some strategies we can employ to build trust with communities we are working with, acknowledging the inescapability of the power and legacy of harm perpetuated by institutions against communities? And finally, and more specific to our context, we discussed the ways in which essentialism relates to Muslims in the West. We considered its harms and also how it plays out in an archival setting. For graduate students, we would promote these principles of accountability through things like frequent meetings, making ourselves available for questions, creating rigorous documentation about these projects rather than just creating the projects themselves. Faculty were really generous in guiding and revising this work. We also made previous projects and learning materials already compiled by the Islamic Center available through centralized cloud storage to each cohort of students so they could clearly see what work had been done and they could use that to scaffold in their own work. Before I provide an overview of what I think some takeaways from this project are for other practitioners embarking on similar work, I wanted to first address how our context afforded particular learning opportunities for our collaborators that I think were unique. Foremost, I want to address the question of why now? Why undertake this work now when, as I mentioned, the ICSC has been around for decades? And after speaking with Sadek and Hashim, it became evident that there was an urgency to document the ICSC within this particular historical moment to the backdrop of our current social and political landscape, while also acknowledging that the knowledge and perspectives of elders needed to be captured before they were lost, and to be more deliberate about preservation moving forward. And when thinking about why collaborating with UCLA students worked well for our context, in addition to the mutual benefit created by these projects and the hands-on experiences it provided to both emerging and community archivists, these projects also created an opportunity for collaborators to explore collectively how to approach urgent and complex topics, including how to document a history that is still ongoing, how that plays out for the ICSC in particular, which is located and shaped by a particular regional context, but is also impacted by crises and processes that are not exclusive to Los Angeles, including things like the ongoing pandemic, Islamophobia, the war on terror, white supremacy, imperialisms, occupation, displacements, and the looming climate catastrophe and other regimes of power. And those are just some of the dimensions we got to explore. So we all got to grapple with and consider what it means to tell that story that exists on multiple axes, terrains, and margins. And as we found out, there are no easy answers or pathways forward when dealing with these dimensions, but I think this project and cohort provided and continues to provide space for us to explore these dimensions and grapple with them together. And in so doing, we're also worked to strengthen the ties between the archival community and a particular regionally situated Muslim community, which has historically not been well served by the archival field. So I want to be clear that I don't intend to be prescriptive or claim that this is a one-size-fits-all model for pursuing informal or formal partnerships between communities and institutionally based partners. But I think if there is any tangible recommendation that I have, it would be to develop, evaluate, and then reevaluate your approach for your context and continually ensure that that process reflects the needs of your participants that are rooted in core ethical principles of humility, accountability, mutual benefit, and learning. And I think it is also essential to continuously reckon with, and this is inspired by Michelle's community archive syllabus, the possibility, but also the impossibility of equity when working with institutions like universities that are deeply embedded within structures of oppression and power and the inescapability of that dynamic. And when the work reflects your particular context, things like the project management, the workflow, the communication, and all other aspects of that work, in my view, will look different depending on your needs and context as the work coalesces around your shared ethics. I've also found that for our purposes, developing cohorts around these projects was a critical accountability measure for not only ensuring that we stayed true to our core ethical framework, but also so that we could grapple with and discuss aspects of this project together and arrive on pathways forward collectively. To that end, my last reflection is to never manufacture a need. You know, we were really fortunate in that Sadek and Hashim reached out to us to initiate this partnership and were involved at every stage. But I imagine if it were the reverse, let's say I, as a representative of the institution, reached out to the Islamic Center and asked if they wanted to collaborate, how that might further complicate our ability to make decisions equitably and collectively. In my view, doing so maybe would have made us liable to that paradigm of parachuting in, one-way knowledge extraction, devaluing the intellectual and emotional contributions of community members, and thinking about how being mindful of that is particularly crucial when working with communities that have experienced ongoing oppressions, violences, and marginalizations, and the risks that work could pose as a result. In my view, that would not be modeling an ethics of care and reparation, and quite the opposite. Before I get to my last slide, here's a picture of myself along with one of our project groups. So from my side, so right to left, so Hannah, Lily, Ashley, Ellie, and then we have Sadiq in the blue, and then another member of the Islamic Center named Kenan, and this was during an on-site visit, which we were really grateful to have. So I'm so sorry, I think I'm like a couple seconds or maybe almost a minute over time. But I just wanted to end by thanking you all for your time and giving me space to share this work. If you want to check out our budding digital archive, I created a bit.ly link that you can see here on this screen. You can also check it out at Islamic Center of Southern California.omeka.net. And I'm happy to answer any questions and hear your feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Salma. So I think we can now go ahead and continue with the next presentation. And once we are concluded with the three presentations, then we can go for the Q&A. And Salma, would you mind posting the URL from your last slide into the chat? Thank you. Grace, I believe you would be second then.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. Okay. So my slides are not going to be entirely related. I'm just going to show some art so you don't have to stare at me talking for 15 minutes. Oops. Okay. I'm Grace Hanji. I'm a graduate student at Queens College in New York, and I work at the City University of New York. And first, I want to acknowledge that I am on unceded Lenape territory. And thank you very much to the Archival Education and Research Initiative for having me. This is also a work in progress, so I'm open to any and all feedback. So thanks very much for listening, and I'll share my sources at the end. So today I'm going to be discussing archival refusal. So instances in which people have had agency and then refuse their inclusion in state or state adjacent archives in particular. So focusing on intentional hiding in contrast to the more like liberal demands for inclusivity, representation, diversifying archives, etc. And then also just thinking through what ideological work diversifying archives performs. So theorizations of refusal, escape, and fugitivity that can be read as archival refusal or frame such inquiries. So I'm going to be looking a bit at other fields theorizations on the topic. And in addition to refusing archival presence, to reject inclusion, I'm going to explore resistance to permanence and examine repatriation a bit as well, and the issues that has played out in the US. So the concept of the right to be forgotten bears some similarity, but the right to be forgotten is derived from European ideas that mostly focus on individual data privacy. So this project is more focused on group refusal to be preserved in state archives. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about archival avoidance as a survival strategy. So for colonized people, avoiding documentation can be a means of survival under imperial domination. Conquer-Good remarks, quote, subordinate people experience text and bureaucracy of literacy as instruments of control and displacement, unquote. And she mentions undocumented and criminalized individuals as examples of groups who view records as possible threat to survival. Also, Tuck and Yang describe the anthropological eye of academia interested in recording the lives of the other, quote, inquiry as invasion. There are some forms of knowledge that the academy doesn't deserve. So thinking through the academy as a site of colonial knowledge production. that is not deserving of subaltern stories. And also Eric Stanley theorizes the potential danger of transvisibility, writing, at the center of the problem of recognition lies this: how can we be seen without being known? And how can we be known without being hunted? So thinking about representation as deadly, and though the archive can reflect instances of violence, inclusion does not guarantee future safety. And while these theorizations are in other disciplines, again, the relation to the archives lies in the inability to document those who escape grasp purposefully, seeing the state archive as what it often is, a mode of surveillance. And when I say state archive, I mean both like the official state archive and also archives that gain funds from the government. So if we take, now I'm going to talk a little bit about, instead of just survival, refusal of inclusion as part of a colonial project. So if we take Ann Solar's claim seriously that the archives are a technology of the imperial state, refusal of archival incorporation becomes a means of indigenous resistance to colonialism. 𝐏𝐚𝐻𝐿 writes, quote, and again, my sources will be at the end: the acknowledgement of past injustices or the confession of contemporary settler privilege is a mechanism for the formation of the settler project and nation, unquote. So she's reflecting on how states use archival incorporation and indigenous appropriation during periods of so-called reconciliation to legitimize their power. Such gestures of incorporation and recognition situate, quote, the abuses of colonialism firmly in the past, leaving the present structure of colonial rule unacknowledged, unquote. So there's been instances of indigenous people rejecting archival presence of their history in favor of oblivion over appropriation, oblivion in the sense of the state archive, and I'll get into examples later. So in addition to refusing, and I'll go to like another art piece in case. So in addition to refusing participation in the colonial project, Utter Simpson writes, evasion of the archive allows for, quote, maintaining alternative structures of thought, politics, and traditions away from and in critical relationships to states. So she reflects on how incorporation not only appropriates indigenous knowledge systems, but also can dilute them. Bell Hooks also cautions about the oppressor's appropriation of the other, of the story of the other, rewriting it for their own use and dwelling on the pain of those marginalized, and echoes of such analysis is also found in the work of Saidiya Hartman. So such descriptions serve a foundation for why colonized people may not want to share their story with the archive, refusing incorporation into the colonial archive. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about resistance to permanence. So in addition to refusing inclusion and thus legitimizing the settler archive, archival absenting also reveals how different cultures conflict with the Western impulse to document everything. So Wang's discussion of the anarchival also includes deconstruction, destructing, undoing, and unbecoming as kinds of archival labor. So thinking about the anarchival as contrast to the archival. Also, Caribbean theorist Glissant writes, quote, the right to opacity. So he theorizes the West demand for transparency, which ultimately leads to reduction, thus invoking refusals to colonial inquiry. Also, Zoe Semdouzi writes about what she terms the Western obsession with permanence. And Reed writes about forgetting, quote, forgetting deletion and erasure in indigenous societies is not simply the inevitable outcome of relying on collective memory rather than written text recording technologies to preserve culture. Rather, forgetting can be just as intentional and valuable as remembering, unquote. And so thinking through how including information and materials of indigenous people not only furthers the colonial project, but also conflicts with other ways of remembering, forgetting, and archiving. So true recovery and reconciliation may not be about just preserving indigenous materials and those materials of those marginalized in state institutions, archives, and museums, but rather allowing for indigenous sovereignty over their own materials using their own archival or anarchival practices. So I'm going to talk about like a few examples of refusals. So there's not a lot in the within library and archival studies that talks explicitly about refusing to be archived, but there's a few scholars in Canada that are doing this work. So I'm going to talk about those case studies. So in 2008, Canada began its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which sought to preserve stories of survivors of Canada's residential schools. And they were looking to preserve the independent assessment process records that documented the experience of those individuals. But there were survivors of those schools who shared their stories in the records that wanted them destroyed, and they had been promised confidentiality. So Godard writes, quote, "Can we consider the impulse of some Indigenous people to destroy the IAP records is driven in part by the imperative to contain the ability of the Canadian state and settler society to penetrate any further into the secrets of an Indigenous diversity that continues to flourish centuries after it was said to be vanishing," end quote. So Godard is reading such a rejection by Indigenous people to have their documents preserved within the settler state as a means to protect their own diversity and culture, similar to Simpson's theorizing of protecting Indigenous knowledge systems from appropriation and dilution by the state, which I talked about earlier. So because recognition in these instances is always playing out on the grounds decided by the settler state, oblivion and forgetting can be preferred to archival presence. And then another example is the Library and Archives of Canada launched a multicultural initiatives office in 2004 to diversify their collections. And another scholar, Vernon, wrote about how, quote, "The National Archive, like the nation itself, gains multicultural identity and legitimacy only insofar as it manages to institutionalize and represent difference. The racialized silences in the archive must be filled," unquote. So she also did research and found that different communities in Canada are archiving their own histories, and when approached by this multicultural initiative, there were like refusals to donate to those archives. So in contrast to the colonial view of the incapacity of these communities to preserve their own histories, there are different archival practices in contrast to the state. And Vernon asks, what are the implications of deterritorializing ancestral materials from local communities? The assumption on behalf of the government that they must fill the gaps in their archives included this incorrect assumption that these records were not already being preserved, or they needed to be preserved through the state. And I'm going to talk a little bit about too how repatriation and the demand for repatriation represents an example of refusing state archives or refusing the presence of Indigenous records in state archives. So there's, for example, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which was passed in 1990 and required institutions that receive federal funding to repatriate Indigenous cultural items, but there's been many issues. They require the tribes requesting materials to be federally recognized, which again, it's playing out on the grounds of the settler state, and there's also a lack of enforcement. So just thinking through how repatriation could represent an example of this archival refusal. So just to wrap it up, and I'll go to a different, okay. Though the liberal rhetoric of inclusion reads archival silence only as a project of the settler state to serve their own interests and sees Indigenous inclusion into the archival project as the solution, reading purposeful absenting in the archive reveals secrecy has the potential to protect histories outside of the colonial project. Community archives and other ways of remembering and forgetting aren't just set up to document lives ignored by the mainstream and state archives. They're ways to preserve memories and histories that intentionally refuse preservation by the state, that elude, subvert, and hide from surveillance. So I'm not attempting to offer a solution, though repatriation may seem a better course of action in contrast to inclusion and reconciliation. I'm just trying to offer a critique of the framing of inclusion to question why the assumption that everyone wants to be included. What is the archival project, serving what ends, what ideological ends, and funded by what entities, controlled through what means? Such an exploration and acceptance that representation may serve only to legitimize archival institutions may lead to more ideas that don't frame state archival presence as liberatory. So I'm now doing some research on court cases where individuals refuse to participate, and reading these as archival refusal. I'd also really suggesting this is going to be in my sources, but Goddard and Codswell's special issue of archival science to go beyond toward a decolonial archival praxis that talks a lot about all of these issues. And I'm just going to end with another quote from Dr. Goddard, quote, "For the archives cannot be decolonized as long as the land is colonized." So I'd appreciate any feedback or engagement. Again, this is a work in progress, and thank you all very much for listening. And I'll go to my sources. I'm going to put this document that has all of these sources in the chat. So yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Grace. And so now it's time for the presentation of Alex and Ashley. So please take it away.
Thank you very much. Good day, colleagues. It's very nice to see all of you. Thank you for being here. I certainly am quite grateful that AERI continues to flourish. My name is Alex Poole, and I'm an associate professor at Drexel University. And my colleague is Ashley Todd-Diaz, who may be announcing herself.
Hi, everyone. As Alex said, I'm Ashley. I'm the Assistant University Librarian for Special Collections and University Archives at Towson University.
So today we'd like to speak to you about a work in progress. And just to provide a bit of context, we were fortunate enough to receive an Institute of Museum and Library Services National Forum grant to explore the trajectory of archival education and ideally to suggest future Freudian slip perhaps, future directions for archival education in the 21st century. This particular presentation is going to focus on the graduate archival curriculum. I should suggest that it is rooted in a mixed methods case study, and I'll say just a bit about that in a minute. So first of all, I wanted to give some context about the very nature of the literature vis-a-vis archival education. And there are 7 broad topics that merit mention. One of them is the longstanding debate about where is the best host department for archival education. And scholars have variously argued about history departments and library and information science departments. Of course, today, library and information science departments have by and large carried the day. The second issue is the notion of education versus training. In other words, education being a holistic learning how to learn and lifelong learning enterprise, whereas training being much more brass tacks and essentially vocational. This funnels into a third topic, which is instructors. That is to say, for a long time, it was assumed that practitioners made the best instructors. By contrast, however, in the last several decades, as observed by folks like Richard Cox and his colleagues, there's been a great deal of momentum toward focusing on research faculty, those folks credentialed with PhDs. Still another aspect of this tension is theory versus practice. In other words, how much theory is appropriate and how much practice, essentially vocational training, is appropriate. And this in turn speaks to another issue, which is that of technological training and hands-on training and practical skills. Still another debate is the role of professional organizations, specifically the Society of American Archivists. And once again, this is of a piece with the various strands of literature that I just discussed. And essentially, what is the SAA's appropriate role? In other words, is it to promote, broadly speaking, education as construed by research faculty? Or by contrast, is it to attend to more vocational training, which is oftentimes what the SAA has cited on? A sixth aspect of the literature focuses on curriculum, and folks have variously debated what duration is appropriate. In other words, can it be done in a year? Can it be done in 2 years? Is an MLS degree appropriate? Should we have a master's in archival science? And similarly, what content is appropriate? In other words, we need to think about the various debates concerning whether we should center the various functions of archives, how we should deal with key emerging topics such as DE&I, social justice, and community archives. A final aspect of the literature is that of individual cases. There have been any number of articles on folks' individual programs and individual courses, so oftentimes reflective and evaluative literature. As I noted a moment ago, this is based on a mixed methods study. Our research question, as you can see here, what are faculty, students, and recent graduates' assessments of the current state of graduate archival education? We chose then to approach this research question in two ways. First of all, we were interested in getting a holistic and insider's perspective. And as a result, we conducted semi-structured interviews with full-time archival faculty. We located these faculty by consulting the Directory of Archival Education and ferreting out the program director for each and seeking to interview them. So we were quite successful at persuading folks to participate, and we were certainly very grateful to them for sharing their insights. Now, on a methodological note, this was, of course, purposive sampling, and we did so to try to secure information-rich cases. A second aspect of this study was predicated upon a survey of graduate students and recent graduates, new archival professionals. So what our metric was for that was to talk to folks who had been in the field for fewer than 5 years. Now, we disseminated our questionnaire not only via the SAA listserv, but also through the nearly 50 archival organizations that are listed on the Society of American Archivists webpage. The survey instrument included both Likert type and open-ended questions, and we were fortunate to have 406 folks start the survey. Certainly not all of them finished, but we were nonetheless very fortunate to get a quite robust and in many ways quite surprising account of what they thought about the current curriculum or their curriculum as they had recently experienced it. Now I'd like to turn it over to Ashley to talk a little bit about results.
All right, so we asked the faculty members, essentially out of the courses you teach, what are the most important or necessary courses that they thought students should take as they're entering into the archival field? And 61% said introduction to archives for a variety of reasons, but mostly to provide that foundation for students to then progress into more nuanced courses. Next, 55% said arrangement and description, followed by appraisal at 33%, and internships or practica to provide, kind of the counterpoint of hands-on experiential learning at 18%. We then asked students a similar question to kind of get a different perspective and see, are these perspectives lining up? I think I need you to advance this slide, Alex. So we asked students and new professionals what the most useful topics they believed to be as they were moving into archival practice. So out of 49 topics, we have kind of the top few, as well as some of the topics that came up in the faculty's responses. So appraisal, social justice, DEI, international participatory community archives. So you see from the students' perspectives, the more hands-on, very practical concepts, arrangement and description, having a practicum, an internship, or some type of experience in the field were the top two. And they were pretty closely rated at 146 students and 141, both felt that they were extremely useful. Then, metadata and finding aids came third and fourth, and you can kind of see, arrangement and description, metadata and finding aids are all pretty closely aligned, but they're all very practical skills. DEI came in 13th in terms of most useful. Appraisal, which we showed in the previous slide as being something that a third of faculty members found to be necessary, was at 16, so still kind of in that top half of the list. But you'll notice that a number of the topics that are really, are emerging in terms of being very important and things that we want to be broadening our awareness of archives and archival practice, students didn't necessarily find to be useful, for better or for worse. If you can advance to the next slide. We also asked students whether or not, so as they were rating those topics, we acknowledged that perhaps some students may not have had a particular topic covered in their coursework. So we offered a not applicable option. And this was fairly surprising in some respects. So out of the students that rated each of these topics, the people participating ranged from 213 to 247. But 60.5% had not touched postmodernism. Slightly less than that, 59% had not addressed digital forensics. Roughly half had not addressed international or participatory archives. But then pretty shockingly, roughly a third of students had not had any coursework that at least they were remembering or recalling on social justice or DEI topics. We also asked both groups if they had courses on a wish list, right, or topics, things that they would like to add to the graduate program, what would they be? So for the faculty, 42% said that they really felt comfortable, that they felt like they were able to fully cover all of the topics they wanted to, or they had some amount of flexibility either with special topics courses or the ability to adjust coursework, that they were good. They didn't necessarily have anything that they really wanted to add. 33% talked about digital archives and digital curation. 15% talked about multimedia archives and perhaps digging into some different formats. And then 12% talked about social justice. On the student and new professional side, 128 of our survey participants addressed this question, and 34% talked about curation. And so this is a broader category. I mean, this addressed things like digital archives, digital preservation, as well as different file formats and, kind of looking broadly at curation. 13% talked about advocacy, outreach, and donor relations as something that they wished they had a little bit more content on. 12.5% talked about DEI and social justice, and 12% talked about kind of the job market in general, right? What to do next, how to take what they had learned and be able to prepare for interviews and the search process and what to expect in terms of job outlooks. We also asked students about how they felt in terms of overall preparation to enter the professional archival field. And for the most part, you can see the majority of students fell in between very well and moderately well. There are only a few students that really felt that they were not prepared well at all. So that is promising. And we asked about improvements. If there were things that could have improved their overall experience and kind of prepared them better to enter the job force, what would that look like? So we had 170 people reply to this, and some of them had multiple recommendations. But by and large, the top recommendation was more hands-on practical experience. And to that point, less theoretical discussion. And so this took many different approaches. I mean, they talked about more hands-on assignments, more opportunities for internships, more opportunities to visit archives and to work with practitioners in a hands-on way, different exposure to technology. I mean, it was a pretty broad category. 41% also talked about different course content. So updating curricula, adding different types of courses, more course offerings that were perhaps online or in person, having just more flexibility in what they could take in terms of coursework. And let's see, course offerings, there were a number of students that were talking about kind of their own limitations in terms of would they be able to attend a class in person versus, if they were working full time, could that be a more flexible online course? If there was a whole set of opportunities for courses on the website, but maybe some were only offered every 2 years or every 3 years, or perhaps the person that taught those courses was on sabbatical, and so there wasn't transparency there. 20% talked more about career guidance and mentorship, whether there was a designated person they could go to, or having a faculty mentor or a practitioner mentor. 10% were interested in having faculty practitioners, some more adjuncts, or having faculty that were more connected to kind of current topics and were more aware of what was going on in the field. 2% didn't feel like the program needed to be at the graduate level. A few other students felt that with more resources, the programs could have been more effective. A few people, of course, because of the timing, felt that their overall experience was impacted by COVID. And one person felt that increased rigor would have improved the program.
Okay, so I think it's fair to say that we were incredibly surprised by the results of the survey. And suffice to say, as we note here, there seems to be a rather profound disjuncture between the way faculty feel about the efficacy and appropriateness of their teaching and the way that students and new professionals feel about it. There are a couple of things that were very striking that play into extending the existing literature. One of the issues that we ran into is simply a matter of terminology or definition. So for example, what faculty, as opposed to students and new professionals, think is hands-on or real world or practical. Along those lines, moreover, we also see differing definitions of what counts, let's say, as curation or preservation or digital archiving. And so on a very fundamental level, there seems to be some challenge in communicating. A second area is that of values, and this funnels into the third area of DE&I and social justice. So the notion of embedding values and embedding ethics in the foci of courses, specifically in terms of topics such as DE&I and social justice, international affairs. As you recall from a previous slide, the way students rated the importance of topics was rather different than the way that faculty saw important things. That being said, of course, both parties thought that certain functional areas such as arrangement and description and appraisal were quite important. But we certainly were surprised not to see what we think of as incredibly important topics percolate down to students and new professionals. A longstanding aspect of the literature is that, of course, of hands-on and practical training. And that remains quite a problem because on the one hand, faculty evince considerable confidence that they are providing practical exercises, but students are very skeptical of that. And so one way of thinking about this is how we might, as faculty members, convey more clearly to students the relationship between what we're teaching and its practical implications. Similarly, technology has been a concern since, well, certainly since post-World War II, when folks started getting quite in a tizzy about what they called automation. So dealing with technology remains a quite vital concern. And in fact, we have a paper at the ACES conference that deals with that. But more specifically, how do we deal appropriately with technology given obsolescence, of course, and also given a very limited number of credit hours in the curriculum? And by extension, the diversity of occupations or occupational positions that folks will occupy in some ways militates against teaching specific platforms. So that's certainly fruitful for further discussion. Along the lines of dealing with translating theory into practice is how we do that and how we attain praxis, in other words, because even when faculty believe they are dealing with translating theory into practice, students and new professionals are rather more skeptical. So we just wanted quickly to mention possible directions for future research. As we mentioned in our methodology section, we focused on directors of archival programs as indicated in the Director of Archival Education, but certainly there are quite a few other full-time faculty, and we would love to have their perspectives on these issues. Similarly, we have a tremendous number of adjuncts in the field and non-tenure track faculty more broadly, and their perspectives would be most welcome as well. This is particularly important because students have indicated that they want current hands-on instruction. And so where do NTT faculty fit into that? We also would be interested in talking to middle career practitioners. It's almost a cliche to say that students sometimes change their opinions of their education over time. And so while we were quite struck at the lack of satisfaction that many folks in our survey showed, perhaps they would feel differently in a few years. So there's a longitudinal possibility there, as well as talking to current middle career practitioners and asking them to reflect on their own experiences as students a bit down the road. I noted a moment ago this issue of praxis. How can we fuse theory and practice? Because it seems that they remain quite disparate in many students' minds, even if they are not at all disparate in faculty members' minds. And finally, we are wondering very much, again, about the specifics or the minutiae of technology instruction. What platforms need to be taught? What skills need to be taught? How can we better prepare students for practice? And so with that, we'd like to thank you very much for your time. And of course, we'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ashley and Alex. So I would suggest that we can have now the time for the Q&A. Let's see. So we have a total of 1 hour for the panel. There is not a whole lot of time. So yes, let's get started. Any questions from the audience? While we wait for questions, I just had one question for Alex and Ashley real quick. At the end of your presentation, you were mentioning that you would like to know more about like the specifics of technology instruction. And in fact, one of the things that I kept thinking as I heard your presentation is the fact that like there are different ways in which this type of curriculum is taught, right? Like at a place like LSU, where I am currently based, all the courses in our Department of Library and Information Science are taught online as asynchronously, whereas in other universities, such as Indiana University, courses are taught in person and synchronously, right? And so I wonder if your data allows you to say anything about that.
Yes, actually, and I can send you a link to one of the papers that we did on that. That issue, of course, was exacerbated by COVID, but I am also in a program in which online asynchronous tends to rule the roost. So it is very, very challenging in that regard. And one director with whom we spoke was talking about how challenging it was to go from having a technology lab where you could mess around, say with Bit Curator, to doing it online. And as he said, it, quote unquote, it just didn't work. So I think that's a really important area for further inquiry. And I think we also need to remember that a lot of students don't necessarily have the machines to deal with installing software. And, I can go ahead and embarrass myself. I've been one who's, when I'm asked to install software, I often muck it up, let's say. So having appropriate tech support is also something that's quite imperative. It's, there are a lot of challenges, suffice to say. And I guess the challenge and the reward of this is it's really a call to action, I think, for all of us.
Thank you, Alex. And I believe that Sumaya Ahmed has a question. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you all for your presentations. I have a question for Salma and also for Alex and Ashley. So for Salma, thank you I was wondering if amongst the students cohorts that you've had from UCLA, if you've had any students who are from Muslim backgrounds who actually have familiarity with the mosque, and I just wonder what kind of reactions or what kind of work or things that might have come out of people from students who actually have a kind of a cultural and a familiarity with, or even actual attended that mosque, and if you saw any kind of dynamicism from that kind of interaction. And then for Alex and Ashley, I'm not surprised at all by your findings, I guess, because I'm in the trenches of Introduction to Archival teaching. And I guess I wonder if you ask when you were speaking to the students and new professionals, if you ask people why they came to the field of archives, like why they want to get a master's in archives, because I think that when we get down to the reasons as to why people are there, like why they're in the room, whether or not it's digital or in the physical space, a lot of it is like to get a job, right? kind of like one time a police officer told me in Chicago, you know, I signed up to be I signed up for a police academy, I signed up for an electrician, the police called earlier. Like, you know, he didn't, you know, he wasn't low, you know, so if it's just if it's a job, right, then the practical is what you have that idea, right? And a lot of students are being told who are humanities undergrads, like, well, you could always be an archivist, right? And so I wonder if that is one of the things that affects that. And students have told me pretty clearly that, you know, the DEI and all of these things is nice, social justice is nice, but at the end of the day, if the institution I work for isn't into that, right? Once again, they need a job. So they're going to do whatever they're going to do. So anyway, those are my 2 things. So I don't know if that probably was not a question. I'm sorry, I've done that. But I'm just gonna say, yeah, I wasn't surprised at all. But I did wonder if you had asked them why they were in the Book of Archives, why they came to it.
I think the first question was Salma.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for your question, Marianne. It's really nice to see you here. Yeah, I think it's a really great question. As insofar as I knew, none of the Muslim students that passed through this program were affiliated with the Islamic Center, but we did have a handful of Muslim students who identify in, you know, various ways. And I think, you know, being in a classroom with Muslims and non-Muslims to talk about the Islamic Center surfaced like really interesting, like dimensions of some of these areas. So one thing I didn't have a chance to talk about in the presentation, but I kind of like alluded to it, was when I talked about like amplification, not empowerment. And I think, you know, a lot of the Muslim students, including a lot of feminized Muslim students, talked about how uncomfortable they are with like this whole, like, we're going to empower the community. It overlooks like their agency, lived experiences, autonomy. So we kind of talked about the importance of amplification and not the dynamic of empowerment, this idea we're going to like bestow something. And I think, you know, having Muslim students in the room really, like, you know, and growing up Muslim myself, those things kind of came out naturally in the conversation. So I'm really grateful for, you know, the multitude of perspectives and experiences that were in the room, and that kind of surfaced it. I think as we move forward with this project, we're looking to involve more folks from the Islamic Center, and I'm going to be really interested to hear, you know, their perspectives on this work. But I hope that answers your question.
Thank
you. And thank you for that question, Sumaya, and I see Eric chimed in as well in the chat. We did not ask folks per se why they chose the field of archives. We did ask them why they chose their particular program, and we will be writing about that. Frankly, we have been drowning on data, and we have been very fortunate to have quite a few publications already, but it's sort of like peeling an onion, I guess, that we keep on getting farther and farther into it. So the 2 questions on the survey that I look forward to unpacking to try to answer that question. Again, why you chose your program, reputation, location, tuition, all those considerations. And we also did ask folks about their academic background. And I think it will surprise no one that, you know, a lot of folks are from the humanities. So I think that both of those point to Sumaya's question. I mean, something that I've also been wrestling with is, if you have a background in liberal arts or humanities, more specifically social sciences, you already have a leg up in that domain area. And yet you may not have been exposed to technology very much. And certainly, not that I want to give away my age, of course, but I was not exposed to technology until I went to grad school. I did my first 2 degrees in history. And so in some ways, there are structural factors that I think might play in as well. But certainly stay tuned, and hopefully we can provide some insight to that question. So thank you.
Well, thank you everybody who attended this panel. I just want to point out that unfortunately we ended right at 2 minutes after the hour, which is exactly, we also started the panel 2 minutes after the hour, so it's exactly 60 minutes. And I just want to point out to everybody that there is a panel right after this where Henria Anton, Krista Sato, Wendy Duff, and Jonathan Thayer are going to be talking about trauma-informed archival practice and documentation of cultural heritage. So I am going to post here the link to that panel session in case you're interested. I thank Ashley, Alex, Salma, and Grace for your presentations, and I wish you all a good rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much.